Hey everyone, welcome to week 10 of vry102 on FX PhD. I'm Dariush. This is our final class of this course. We are going to be taking a look at rendering in Elements and putting this guy back together. In a Back to Beauty comp, we'll be using After Effects, but we'll also use Nuke as well to take a look at the different workflows in those two packages. So we have our scene here. We've got hair and everything going on. We're going to pick a new camera angle for our render cam, so you get a little bit more of that hair coming through. We'll also take a look at turning on GI to get a little bit more fill as well into our scene. So let's start there. We'll go into the render globals, and in the GI tab, we'll just simply turn it on. Now, you need to go into the V-Ray tab under Environment and take a look at our overrides. We place an override for the reflection texture, which is this HDRI, outside sunny day small.hdr, which you should have in your source images folder from one of the previous projects. But there's also a GI texture with a light blue that overrides the GI. So this will actually be contributing to the lighting of the scene. There's two things we can do. We can opt to take a look at our HDR, which is this guy right here. We can feed that into the GI texture, or we can create a dome light and attach our HDR to the dome light. The two will give you pretty similar results, except with the dome light, you'll have control over intensity, where with the GI texture override, you won't. Here I've got a couple of renders, starting with a render of our character as we have it from last week. We got some of that hair coming through and some of that fur, of course. Pretty dramatic lighting, and we did the extra lighting texture underneath the shell that brings out some of these areas, again from week 9. Now what I did here with this render is I plugged our HDR into the environment override, and this is the render that we got. It's definitely brighter because there's an HDR that's contributing to the GI now. I took the same exact HDR and I put it on a light dome, which is spherical, but at all its defaults. I didn't increase the intensity or anything like that, and we get very similar results, except the dome light proves to be a little bit more clean. Now these dots, they're coming from the reflection, pretty much, mostly. However, we have a cleaner reflection pass, and it's very slightly brighter, very, very slightly brighter. Our render times between the environment override is negligible. It's only about a 4.5 to 5 second increase using the dome light as opposed to the environment override. So what we'll do is, instead of using an override for the GI, we're going to go ahead and make sure this is black, and we'll create a dome light in our scene. And the scene you're going to want to start with today is Alien Bust V05, found in your download files for this week. So we'll go ahead and make sure our GI override is set to nothing. Otherwise, that's going to contribute to your lighting as well. We just want our sunny day to give us just a little bit more fill, because we're going to take on a little bit more of a side angle so we can get some of that hair in here. Go ahead and create our dome light. We will make it invisible. We're going to leave the intensity at 1. And we're going to go spherical. That's important, so we have even consistent lighting throughout. Use dome text on, and middle mouse button drag our outside sunny HDR over to our dome text. and we are good to go to having our GI. Let's make sure GI is turned on. We're going to do irradiance map and brute force. That's totally fine. We're not animating, so we're going to leave our irradiance map settings to their current high preset. We'll set up our camera to get a nice view of our creature. Get some hair in there, as well as getting a little bit close on the face there. And we'll go ahead and render with GI enabled and our extra dome light. And here's our radiance map pre-pass. Now I've killed the render because I'm noticing a seam that we're running into with the displacement map. There's a little bit of photoshopping we need to do, and I've updated the map. So we go into our object, into our V-Ray displacement node, and we see that we are using the shell amount 03. I have updated that to shell amount 04. You'll find that JPEG in your download for this week. So once you swap in shell amount 04, we get rid of that seam. So go ahead and swap that out, and we'll run a full render with the updated texture. As you can see from the pre-pass, the GI adds quite a bit of illumination to the hair, which is nice. We'll see that that seam is gone from the top of his head, and that we're getting a little bit more of a fill on this side of the face. In addition, the self-illumination from that extra light material that we added to the skin will also help the GI calculation, because it actually will increase not just the direct light as we directed it to last week, but also the GI contribution as well. And once we break this out into elements, we'll be able to take a look at each of those elements and really understand how they all come together. And if I right click on my VFB, I can see the floating point numbers for where we are, and we're getting, fairly hot. We're about 2 at the highest with that backlight. We can back that off, and of course I do like the more dramatic lighting, so our fill is a little bit too strong for my taste, so we can start adjusting the lights to our liking a bit more. Here's our rim light back here. Let's bring that down to about a 30. And the dome light as well, let's move that up next to the other lights. And let's knock that back just a little bit to about 0.7. With a slight change to the camera, we have a little bit of a darker fill, and our highlights not quite as bright. We're still a little bit above 1, but that's pretty cool. We can use that for bloom. And our angle's pretty good to go. You're going to want to pick the angle that best matches what you want. Same thing with the lighting, but I'm pretty happy with this. Now, through the VFB, you can see the only channels we have are RGB and alpha, which hold up pretty nicely. But we're going to break this up into elements. So into the render settings we go. Under the render elements tab, we're going to want to do a basic back to beauty set of passes. Now a simple back to beauty pass basically starts with the lighting element plus global illumination plus reflection plus specular plus refraction plus SSS, if you have it, plus self-illumination. When you plus those together, you'll get your beauty pass. Now, plus is a transfer mode that you can use with the merge node in Nuke, but you can also use a screen in After Effects to get pretty much the same transfer mode that you would get from a plus in Nuke. A little bit different. We'll take a look at the differences when we put this back together. So we'll start with lighting element, and we'll just go ahead and double click to add this to our render elements over here. We're going to add our global illumination pass, our GI element, our reflection, our specular, refraction on top of that, subsurface scattering, and then our self-illumination pass. This is the basic stack that you're going to need for Back to Beauty. In the render settings under render elements, you can enable and disable each of these elements by clicking the Y or N. These work with render layers as well. So if you have different render layers, for example, if we go ahead and create a new render layer, you can turn elements off per render layer and it will create an override, as you can see here. Now we don't really need to have a render layer, so we're going to just stay with our master layer. You can separate all the elements into separate folders if you prefer, and you can access the properties for each of these render layers by simply selecting them and taking a look in the attribute editor. It will put a file name suffix according to the different render layer, which is fantastic. You're going to want to see that, especially if you're rendering with individual EXRs as opposed to multi-channel EXRs. And because we'll be using After Effects as well as Nuke, we're going to do the individual files. So this will be very, very handy in identifying which element belongs to which EXR file that we will output. While we're at it, let's go into our image format options under V-Ray Common. We're going to set our image format to regular EXR and not multi-channel. Now, the only reason I'm not using multi-channel is to demonstrate each of these elements as its own separate file. But you may go straight to multi-channel if you have an After Effects workflow that will allow you to work multi-channel easily, or if you're using something like Nuke, which handles multi-channel very, very well. So for me, I'm going to go to regular EXR, and under the image format options, I'm going to make sure that my OpenEXR is set to at least 16-bit half float, which is more than adequate for what we're doing here, but if need be, you can go to full float with 32 bits. We're going to keep ours at 16-bit. That'll give us plenty of color to play with in composite for all of the elements that we output. Go ahead and close that. And all we need to do now is check to make sure we're in the frame buffer and render our scene again with the render elements active that we've selected. A few other render elements that we're going to add later will be an ambient occlusion pass, a Z-depth pass, and we'll take a look at doing some multi-mats that'll separate out the eyes from the rest of the body as well as the hair. For now, let's get our basic Back to Beauty comp rendering with our 7 render elements that we need for the simple Back to Beauty. Now, the actual render hasn't changed from what we had before. However, it now has all the channels that we set up in our render elements. As we go through them, we have the alpha channel, of course. Here's our lighting pass, GI, reflection pass, specular, refraction, SSS, self-illumination. To write these out through the V-Ray frame buffer, you'll want to click and hold down this icon and select where to put your files. Also, you'll want to tell it you want OpenEXR. This will save individual images and will save all the channels. We just give it a name. Go ahead and call this test A and hit save. And here's our output. We have an EXR file for all the elements as well as the actual beauty itself. So now let's take a look at compositing these back together in Nuke for back to beauty. And here we are inside of Nuke. This is a slightly older version of Nuke. I'm going to go ahead and grab all my EXRs and drag them right into our Nuke window. That'll give me a file read for all of our separate elements. Here's our beauty pass. This is what we've come to expect. Get a little bit closer on that. So, again, we want to go through lighting plus GI plus reflection plus spec plus refraction plus SSS plus self-illumination. We will do that with merge nodes. So we have to start with our lighting pass. Hit M for merge. And the merge node needs to be set to a plus. This is quite important. And the lighting pass will have plus to it the GI pass first. Go ahead and connect these two together. And then we're going to start a new viewer. Here's our lighting pass. Here's our GI pass. And these two added together look like this. Now, off of this merge node, we'll start another merge node, making sure that the operation is set to plus. And we'll be adding the reflection pass next. There we go. And here's before and after. Next, we'll be adding another merge, so M for merge. And we're going to be adding our specular. Of course, we have to make the merge node a plus. There we go. Before, after. And that's the spec pass added on. We'll next be adding our refraction pass. That'll give us our eyes and a lot of our hair. So off of this latest merge, we'll add another merge. Turn that over into a plus. Connect it. And there we go. So that adds a little bit of illumination to the hair as well as giving us our eyes. Add another merge. Turn that over to a plus. And we will be plussing our subsurface pass. Here's SSS. Before, after. So that gives us a lot of that skin coloration, a lot of that flesh tone, a lot of that vulnerability to our character is coming from the pinkness of that SSS. Now you can do all sorts of nice color corrections to this. You want to make your alien look a bit more alienistic, if that is a word. Lastly, we're going to add our self-illumination pass. We'll go ahead and put our merge on. Make sure that operation is set to a plus for our merge. And that will be adding into our workflow here is the self-illumination. So here we go, before and after. And that self-illumination gives us that cool kind of look. We can use this in any greater detail or less detail that you see fit by just adjusting that channel, that element. Now let's compare our original with our beauty. We go back and forth. This is the full render from Maya. And this is our back to beauty comp. They are perfectly synchronized. Not a thing is different. This is the simple way to put a back to beauty together. But now you've got a lot of control over how much each of these passes contributes to your image. So now let's take a look at how this stacks up in After Effects. We'll grab our files and pull them in. And we'll start stacking them with the lighting pass first. This is really where the naming conventions are super helpful, because you can see exactly what's going on, especially in After Effects, where you tend to be a little bit more file name dependent than you are in Nuke, where you can see icons a little bit easier. But anyway, we've got our lighting pass, and then on top of that is our GI. And the GI will add in with a transfer mode of screen. Typically is the best way to add that on. We'll add reflection next as a screen. And then specular as a screen. And then refraction again as a screen. Then we'll add our SSS as a screen. And finally the self-illumination as well, a screen. Now let's take a look at our actual beauty render. I'll put this on top. We can see there's a difference in the brightness. Everything else comes in pretty well. However, it looks like our reflection and our spec and our lighting passes are coming in just a little bit brighter than they did in Nuke. And this is something you can adjust fairly easily by adjusting your opacities or darkening things down. For example, we can bring down our spec pass pretty easily with opacity. So you can dial in that brightness to get it closer. So it's not ideal. It does end up being a little bit brighter. That's just kind of what you have to live with when you're doing VFX compositing in After Effects with the back to beauty. Doesn't quite plus the same way as Nuke does. But it's not that far off, and it gets you the same sort of mileage and definitely gets you the same level of control. Now, some additional elements or passes you may want to add. Z-depth is always a good thing to add. And when you click on the Z-depth, you'll have your extra V-Ray attributes that give you your depth for the black to white Z-depth. Our scene to camera, if we grab this and snap it to our camera, the distance to the front of our head is about 38, give or take. See, we got about 35. So So our head starts at about 35 and goes to about 65. So what I've done here is I've put in my 35 to the front of the face and my 65 to the back of the head. We can adjust that a little bit, make it 30 and 70 to get a little bit more reach. But this should put pretty much the Z depth of the head as the primary depth that we'll get. And as a result, our Z depth looks like this, where we've got dark as close and bright as far away. Personally, I like to run the Z depth pass opposite this. What I like to do is have my deep be black and my near be front. This way, my depth being dark melts right into the darkness of the background. So this is the Z depth type that I personally prefer, one that's bright up front and sharp. But you can go either way. Here we see a little bit of that displacement issue still in the map. So the displacement map needs to be painted between those seams a little bit better at those UV areas. So we're just going to ignore that because we can. However, if you're actually doing this for production, you're going to want to fix that as best as you can. Now, as a quick example how to use the Z depth pass, I'm going to go ahead and click the single disk icon, this top one, to save out this Z depth pass only. Doesn't save everything out. I've already done that. We'll go into my After Effects comp, and I'm going to go ahead and bring the Z depth EXR right into my project here. Now for After Effects, I'm going to pull it in to my top channel there, and I'm going to take our beauty comp. I've got an adjustment layer on here, and I'm going to do a lens blur effect. And for my blur map, I'm going to use the Z depth EXR, which is on layer 1. I need to invert it because of the way I like to run the Z depths. Of course, you may not need to, but right off the bat, we've got a nice depth of field that is controllable through comp. We can use the self-illumination to create a grayscale mask that we can use in composite to control the overall self-illumination. Use it maybe as a glow or a glare mask in composite. However, if you want a more direct map for the skin cracks, we can use something called the extra text element. When you create the extra text element, you've got options to add a texture node. And in this case, we're going to be looking for the skin crack map, which is right here. We'll go ahead and connect it directly to our extra text by middle mouse button dragging it over to the texture slot. And essentially what the extra text will do is give me a pass which is similar to Maya's surface shader with that file attached to it. We'll go ahead and add a file name suffix called skin cracks, and that will be a moniker that we can use in comp. I'll also want to name the V-Ray render element as well. We'll go ahead and put skin cracks up here. That way we can see it in our render elements list. We're going to make another extra text for an ambient occlusion, which I'm going to call AO. For the file name suffix, you can put in ambok, for example, although I prefer AO, and that'll put the AO suffix into the name. And this extra text will be controlled by a V-Ray 2D texture called V-Ray Dirt. Now the V-Ray Dirt texture is basically ambient occlusion. It'll connect to our extra text AO through the texture slot. We'll go ahead and middle mouse button drag that over. And now this element will serve as an AO pass. The controls give us radius, which controls how far the occlusion goes, as well as the occluded color, black to white. You can change the colors, but it's customary to black to white. Subdivisions control how much noise there might be in the AO. And in the occlusion mode, you can select a regular ambient occlusion or one of the 3 different reflection occlusions between Phong, Blinn, and Ward. We'll keep ours at the regular ambient occlusion. And since we have eyeballs that are transparent, we'll need to turn on work with transparency so those eyes don't go opaque. Now that we've added these 2 extra text nodes, we'll need to re-render to get to see the channels in the VFB. And here we have those 2 channels in this new render. Here's the AO pass, including the hair and the whiskers inside that pass, and the skin cracks map, which we can use as a more direct map to control the self-illumination on and in between the shell for our character. Now in our ambient occlusion, you'll notice that we have the hair as well, and that may be something you don't want to occlude. You can go ahead and exclude it by going into the extra text attributes. You'll find an exclude list slot, so if you go ahead and click the arrow, it'll make a set inside of Maya, and all you have to do is add those parts in the relationship editor to that set. And since it's the hair that we want to get rid of, I assigned all 3 of those nodes, and when we go to render, you'll see that these parts end up being removed from the render. As you can see here, the hair is being excluded from the AO pass itself. I can use the relationship editor to add any other objects to that exclusion list. And all extra texts will have an exclude list to them, so you can go ahead and exclude whatever from any of the extra texts. Now we're going to take a look at creating what's called a multi-matte. Multi-matte is an RGB render with red, green, and blue for different mattes for an object. Now these are typically run by using object IDs. Our objects here are pretty simple. We've got eyes, we've got bust geometry, we've got fur whiskers, and we've got hair as different parts of our object, and each one of those can have an implicit control in comp by using multi-mattes. Now, if I select the geometry and I go to the shape node for that geometry, I'll be able to add an extra V-Ray attribute called object ID, which will attach to that geometry and give me an object ID number. However, I prefer to create V-Ray object properties through the Create menu. This is a little bit easier to control and gives you more options. And you can apply multiple properties to your selection or single. We're going to go ahead and apply a single object property to this one selection of the mesh body for our bust. And this makes a set of sorts in the outliner, which contains all the V-Ray object properties. And there's quite a few tricks and things that we can use to control our render. Comes very, very handy in comp. One of those things is the object ID. An object ID as you saw, can be an attribute on the actual geometry. However, the vray object property can override that individual object ID attribute on the object itself. With the vray object property, I'm going to set the object ID to 1, and I'll turn it on by clicking on the override. Now I'm going to select my remaining objects, the eyes, the whiskers, and the hair, and I'm going to go to Create vray Object Properties. I'm going to apply multiple object nodes to the selection, and it'll create a new vray object property for each of the objects that I've selected. Now, I'm going to go ahead and set a vray object property for the eyeball itself by giving it an object ID of 2, and the hair will get an object ID of 3, and our fur whiskers will have an object ID of 4. You can add any object to an existing vray object property, and it will take those settings. For example, I can add all of the hair system nodes to my vray object property for the PFX hair, and they will all inherit the same object ID as the hair. I'm going to go ahead and do that with the inner eye as well and attach it to the object property that is being shared with the cornea. Now both of these will have the same exact object ID set forth in here. Now the attributes for these give you all sorts of control where you can turn off visibility. For example, primary visibility can be controlled en masse by using a vray object property instead of individually at each shape node. And you can turn things off like reflections and refractions, casting shadows, or visibility in GI by just adjusting the object property for that selection. Makes it a lot easier to do with vray object properties that you can see here in the outliner. Now that I have my object properties set up, I'm going to go back into the render settings under the Elements tab. I'm going to make a multi-matte render element by just double-clicking it here. When I select it, I'll take a look and I see that I've got a red object ID, a green, and a blue. And just by setting the number, 1 for red, 2 for green, and 3 for blue, each of those sets of objects in the vray object property will take on those colors. I'm going to make a second multi-matte, and I'll set my red object for this one to 4 for my whiskers, and then everything else will be black. Now if I want anti-aliasing, I'm going to want to check on Consider for anti-aliasing to make sure that my multi-mattes render with the same edges as my actual render. I can always cut them with the alpha channel from the beauty render, but it's a little bit easier to turn on anti-aliasing right here for the multi-mattes themselves. Now renders, you can see I've got a multi-matte where the hair is blue, the eyes are green, and the body is red, and the whiskers are left out because they're object number 4. They're on the second multi-matte, and we can see them plain as day as red in this matte while everything else is black. This gives me implicit control in composite, so I can change however I want the different objects of my character. And that brings us to a close to the Maya portion of vry102 for FX-PHD. We're going to take a quick look at the workflow differences when creating vray render elements in Max.
Hi, I'm Max.
Now, if you're following along in 3ds Max, you're going to be in AlienBus vo5.max scene file. This has our rim light turned down to a multiplier of 30, and it also has a dome light added in with our outside sunny day HDR already mapped to it. The only difference is going to be in render setup. in how you set your elements. Once you go to Render Setup, render elements are added by clicking the Add button and then selecting them from here. We're going to want the same render elements. We've got V-Ray lighting. We'll double click that to add. You can select them multiply by clicking and holding down the Control key. So I'll do that with GI. And we'll add reflection. Now we're going to want the full reflection, not any of the raw ones. We're going to want specular, refraction. Again, we don't want the raw or the filters. We're going to want the subsurface scattering. And finally, the self-illumination. Click OK, and all of them will be added to our render. But when you click on one of these and click Enabled, you're going to get this message. Basically, because we're using the VFB, the render element will look like it's turned off, but will actually render out just fine. Now, just as we did in Maya, creating an extra text element will allow us to have ambient occlusion, as well as doing a skin cracks map. So we'll go ahead and add 2 of these extra texts. And go ahead and name this one AO. And call this one skin cracks. And down here, you can see the texture slot that we can put in for our needs. So we'll first go and create a V-Ray dirt material. There we go. We'll create this, and from the output socket, I can dump it right into our texture slot as an instance. The parameters for a V-Ray dirt are pretty much the same as we saw in Maya. The radius controls how far the occlusion spreads, while we can control the color. Again, it's generally black to white. You can always tint it in comp if need be. And also the subdivs control any sort of noise. And of course you've got regular ambient occlusion or reflection occlusions as well. Now, for our skin cracks, oops, actually did it backwards. We want the AO, the dirt map, to go into the map slot for our extra text AO. And for our extra text skin crack, we want our skin crack map, which is found right here. Go ahead and output slot and replace the AO I accidentally put in as an instance, and that will replace that. And that's pretty much it to creating the extra texture element in 3ds Max. Of course, Z-depth is also an option that we chose in Maya. Go ahead and pop open a Z-depth pass, and our parameters are pretty much the same. We've got a min and a max, as well as the chance to invert the Z-depth. So we can do our min and max from before, which was 30 and 70. And once you render, you'll have all these channels in your VFB to save out for your comp. And that's pretty much it. The differences in render elements in 3ds Max and Maya are pretty subtle. Everything works the same in comp once you get your frames out. I hope this has been a helpful class for you. This is the end of vry102 for FXPHD. I'm Dariush Darkshani. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you had a little bit of fun along with learning a thing or two about V-Ray for Maya as well as 3ds Max. Take care, have fun, and see you on the forums. Join me for any other classes through FX PhD in the future.